All right, Dr. Heitner, hello.
Hi,
How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show.
What a pleasure. What a pleasure. So yeah, let's just jump right in. Tell me, how does one get into media technology in society? What does that look like?
I mean, honestly, like you try a couple years in the workforce and you think maybe a PhD would be a good idea, which I mean, I can tell you if you're listening, think twice about that. But at the time,
Okay.
it seemed like a good idea at the time. I was very good at school and research. I wasn't having a great experience. Turns out I was, working at my job. I didn't know I had ADHD. So I had like good hyper focus, but not good executive function, which also made my doctoral program hard, but that was a little more forgiving. And then I started researching about Sesame Street for my master's paper, which had always been kind of interesting to me. And that got me into questions about kids and race and identity, because there was a big anti-racist curriculum. And then
Mhm.
I ended up, when I was teaching college years later, teaching classes on kids and media and culture. And when I had my own son in 2009, all of those kind of interests in teaching and research percolated. And I realized parents are so lost and everyone's getting a smartphone. And I think adults don't know what to do with this stuff. They don't know how to guide kids. And I just recognized there was a real need for parents to have research-based information on these topics.
Yes. Well, and I really love that too, the importance of making sure that there is so much information out there to be consumed and making sure that we're being intentional about understanding where we should put our focus, where would be best to put our focus. Because confirmation bias exists. And if you want to Google that a screen time of 10 hours a day is good, I'm sure somebody somewhere's written that article. So yeah, that makes sense. And also I love that Sesame Street was the kickoff. That's wonderful.
Yep. My dad says I've been writing my dissertation since I was 3.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I love that so much. And good information. I'm going to listen to this over and over again. My goal has been sort of to get my PhD when my daughter goes to kindergarten, but I'm going to listen to this and remind myself, like, maybe not. I've had a couple people recently be like, don't do it.
I mean, we can talk about it after we record, but I think
Yes.
there's a lot of pluses and minuses. And if you can do it in a way that really works for you and have a realistic outcome in mind, I think
Yes.
that's great. But I think it's really hard, especially as a mid-career person. Yeah, just to be treated the way they treat grad students sometimes too is a little shocking. Because you're like, wait a minute, I'm an adult. Why are you talking to me that way?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that too. So I'm literally, we will also definitely talk about this when we stop recording, but I won't try to pester you too much. That I'm writing a book right now about like distractibility and attention struggles because I was diagnosed with ADHD in 1994, and I'm noticing so many of my clients are experiencing either recognizing that it was an issue for them as a child and therefore finding an ADHD diagnosis later in life, or it wasn't an issue as a child, so they don't have a diagnosis, but the attention struggle is still there. And of course, too, little girls in the 90s didn't really have ADHD, air quotes, right? So a lot of us went undiagnosed. I'm lucky I was not one of them. And so it's just been really interesting to see that conversation as well, and how the social media components of that take place, because we're just constantly scrolling and getting those dopamine hits, and we're watching TV, but we're scrolling Instagram while listening to a podcast while trying to cook meals on it's a lot.
Yeah, I think our brains are distracted, but we also, it's fair to say, live in a distracting world. And I do
We
think
do.
that there are some external, I mean, I do believe that, like there are neuropsychological differences between people. And I don't believe that, for example, ADHD is just a result of like smartphones and social media. I think people
Oh,
who
no,
think
no, no.
like video games, no, I know, but there is an idea out there like, oh, video games give kids ADHD. And it's more like, well, no, but a certain kind of mind is going to have like a harder time getting off video games and onto homework, right? Like all kids will have some struggle with that transition, but
Sure.
some kids, it'll be
Sure.
more of a struggle. So I think the
Yeah.
vulnerabilities are there, differently. And our societies have just adapted. Like, ADHD could have been really valuable in a hunter-gatherer society. And I think in a creative, content-driven society, it's also very valuable, but we just have to find our niche. But,
Yes.
is your niche, a high school day with 9 42-minute periods? Maybe not.
Oh, and that I love that, and I wish that we could get that. I feel like the message is being spread, but people learn differently, and that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that. And the expectation that you set for 9 42-minute sessions, or kindergartners and from 9 to 3, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that person. The wrong is when we try to force them into that space, and then they can't conform, and then it's kind of on us as the adults to be able to find something that's more adaptive for them. I love that. And I love your reference too, because I listened to a podcast by someone called Dax Shepard. I don't know if you're familiar with his show,
Yeah.
I'm sure expert. And he has dyslexia, and he talks the same thing, like the hive mind, and like back in the day, like having that might have been a helpful thing, or like ADHD, being able to go out and do certain things while other people had different jobs. And yet now we're all meant to go to school the same way and learn the same things. And absolutely, just with evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. And so, so what does digital well-being look like? I know that's probably a whole, we could spend the whole hour talking about it, but kind of the elevator pitch for that.
So digital wellness is when your tech is helping you live the life that you want to live and stay connected to the people you want to stay connected to. And you have a life in person that also feels good to you, and you're getting your sleep, and you're, so it's a balanced life. It's a life where, most of the time the things you do digitally are bringing you either joy or learning or connection, or at least something pragmatic that you need. And it's not about you're not living for it, like it's doing its work for you. Your phone or your computer should be working for you. It's a tool.
Mm,
It shouldn't be like you working to like keep your life looking good for LinkedIn or Instagram. It
yes.
shouldn't be about always having something to post or share, or
Mm-hmm.
being sort of feeling enslaved to responding all the time to other people.
Mm-hmm. That's what I love that you mentioned that. I immediately, what I thought, I was like, for me, YouTube, it's like, how do I change my oil in my lawnmower? Like, go to YouTube. It's working for me. Or I need a recipe that I can't remember off the top of my head, or a conversion metric for, how many ounces are in a cup or whatever. And I like to be able to think about that, like being intentional about thinking, am I servicing my Instagram followers, or am I utilizing technology in a way that's meaningful and assisting me?
100%.
So what, I know you kind of focus on all, what are the general age ranges that you look at for levels of digital engagement? Like 0 to 2, 2 to 5, what does that look like?
I mean, a lot of our little kids, really 0 to at least 4, it's, kids are using our devices. They're playing with our stuff. The swipe screens or touch screens are very friendly to a pre-reader. So that's probably like 0 to 6, because it's so digitally, like it's so picture oriented. It's very easy to use a screen, whereas a keyboard oriented computer was really only accessible to someone who could type and read. And so,
Sure.
touchscreens do really extend down the use of screens to much younger kids, but that's a problem sometimes because the apps aren't necessarily very well designed developmentally for little kids. So, some of my colleagues like Lisa Guernsey talk about like the wild west of the app store for small children. And it's true, there's like a lot of junk in there. And there is some good stuff, but there's like a lot of junk. And there's also just stuff that's fun for them to do, like making videos or whatever. So if you give your phone to your 4-year-old, you might come back with like a heck of a lot of selfies, a lot of videos, like they're going to reorganize your apps. So you might not even need like a toddler app if you're brave and you just don't mind like your apps getting reorganized. You just kind of like hope that they don't like add their thumbprint for your bank instead of you, or, change anything. It's like really
Yes.
problematic, or text anybody they shouldn't. I think a lot of people have gotten those texts from somebody else's kiddo.
Sure.
But there's
Sure.
a lot of accessibility there, but I think with that accessibility comes a responsibility of adults to do design features that are kid friendly, or not to, overshare the device with kids. But I think they see us on it all the time at that age. Then as they get into, the early reading years and elementary school, there's a ton of apps and games that a lot of kids are using, your Roblox, your Minecraft, all kinds of other things. And there's a lot of fun to be had. And that's when kids are even getting into digital communities already. I mean, people think they're going to wait till middle school for a phone, but if your kid is on Roblox with their classmates, they're essentially in a kind of a, group digital experience. And so we need to teach digital civility as soon as we're teaching playground civility. I mean, it's like, how do you get along with someone, who's on the slide when you want to be on the slide? And how do you take turns? Like all of those skills are going to also show up in the digital world. And then as kids get older, more and more of the social connection they're having with peers is digital. So by 4th, 5th, 6th grade, a lot of kids are on group texts, and this is even pre-social media, but they might have a group text with their whole class. They might be communicating through Google Classroom. And then in middle school, many of them are using TikTok, YouTube, social apps. And by high school, it's hard to, think about separating a kid from their phone because it's like an appendage, right?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And that's so interesting because those are things that my kids are 2 and 4. And we have a pretty, I I don't want to say strict, like we just don't really use a lot of technology. I really like the kids come home from school and we have a lot of fun things that they play with. And on weekends, certainly we'll have the TV on or something. But so it's really interesting for me to think like Google Classroom, not something to think I've had to think about now, but like you're talking about the group digital experience or like Roblox, and I've heard of that, but like even younger, because in my mind I've had experts on in the past too who talk about like don't give your kids phones until like high school and whatever, but it's like it's not just whether or not they have their own individual iPhone, it's the other places that they can gain access to that and the other ways. I love what you talked about too with the civility, so we're not creating future keyboard warriors. And
right, exactly, because we're living in a world where there's way too much of that, and so anything we can do to make the world friendlier and more civic.
Yeah. And it's tough too, because there is so much to be said for that. There are you mentioned learning activities and places where they can participate in different things that would be very helpful for their academic and their social and all of that. And so it's kind of figuring out, what that looks like. Sure. And so I noticed, so we're talking about in your new book that's coming up, so we're kind of jumping around and I apologize, but we're talking about like tracking our kids' moves with apps. The thing that made me like stress about is like being able to see their grades within minutes of being posted. What is that? How do we find a balance between having access to their teachers all the time, getting their grades within minutes of being posted, all of the things that are there to be able to help them, but also to make sure that they feel like they're kind of growing up as their own individual person, or they have a little bit more of autonomy as they grow? What does that look like?
Ideally, they are not having us kind of monitor them all the time. Like ideally, they're kind of living their own lives, and they're, school, for example, there's like a healthy relationship between, your child and his or her teacher, you and your child, and you and the child's teacher, but it's not constantly, all three directions of communication. Ideally, the main relationship between school and your child is them, and then you're on the outside mentoring them, advocating if changes need to be made, supporting them. But, ideally, like you shouldn't be in touch with the teacher all the time. And teachers really can't do that, right? That's not a possibility. Like if a teacher has 30 or even 20 students, she can't be like in daily contact with every parent every day. And yet the grading apps kind of encourage sometimes parents, I think, to like reach out too frequently. I think those apps are there with good intentions, but they give parents a little bit too much information about what's going on. I think obviously if my kid is struggling, I'm like, don't wait till May to tell me. Like, don't tell me at the end of the year, like, oh, your kid is failing. Like, obviously, if your kid is really struggling, you do need to know before the end of the year, because there may be things you can do to help. It may be that the class placement is wrong. They may need help outside of school. Sure. It may be that the school needs to be providing help in the form of a 504 or an IEP, an individualized education plan, right? Like there's a bunch of things that should be happening if a kid is struggling. But day to day, do you need to see every quiz grade, or do you need to know if your kid spoke out without raising their hand, which is the Class Dojo app? Like, you probably don't need that level of micro information, and it's probably not healthy in terms of the anxiety that so many parents already carry to get that much information about your child's school day. And so I think these apps can actually increase anxiety and really frustrate the relationship, because sometimes parents can't help themselves. They sort of pounce on their kids when they walk in the door, like, why did you get this or that grade? And the kid literally might not have seen it yet. And imagine if you walked in from work and your spouse was like, why didn't your 11 o'clock presentation at work go well? Because they already knew, like, versus you getting to tell them about your day and ask for support. Or maybe you don't want to talk about your day, you just want to have your evening, right? But like either way, that should be your decision.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So I have to admit, again, 2 and 4, I have anticipatory anxiety of this sort of thing. My son will be in kindergarten next year, and I can tell you it's been meaningful for a number of ways when he was younger, because that's where, if he's 2 and he's starting to, well, he wasn't biting it too, but for example, like if a child is biting or something, like things that can be helped at home, because that's our job in that situation. But I love the way that you've described that. Like if I come home and my husband's like, that 11 o'clock presentation was really terrible. I mean, whoa, hey, like I feel attacked.
Incredibly invasive, right? And it just wouldn't be good for your relationship.
No. And that's interesting too. I wasn't aware that apps like Class Dojo they can put in spoke without raising hand, and that to that minutia. And so I really like the fact that it's available, certainly, and also helps that teachers don't have to be shooting off emails and being as individualized in that way, perhaps that helps them with their classroom management and their time management. Because I imagine that has to be, I can't imagine being a teacher these days, especially with 20 and 30 kids. But yeah, I think that's a good way to be intentional about how you want to utilize that information, allowing the kids to come home and take their space and bring it to you when they're ready to discuss such a thing that was going on versus, I know what you did, I know what you did.
Right, right.
Yeah, I have to admit, I have some anticipatory anxiety about all of that because I remember when my son's school got daycare when he was very young, got cameras. And I was like, that's going to be bad for me because I miss him during the day, but I don't need to be sitting there watching him all day. And so I had to be really intentional about the boundaries of like, turn your phone off. You don't need anything, right? That sort of thing.
I think that's so important. And I think recognizing that it can actually make you feel worse, just like all the apps, even when we send our kids to sleepaway camp, they give us a lot of pictures and some people love it. And I get that, but I just think in some ways it can be, it can also, make you feel worse, especially if you search the pictures and you don't see your kid, then you can start to kind of imagine like, what's wrong? Why don't I see them?
They're not in
it's
pictures.
really
That means they're crying in their bunk room, or
right. And they're probably just like swimming right now or something, but it's just, it just adds to your worry.
Yeah.
I think we all have decreased our tolerance for ambiguity and not knowing. And that's why people are like, I need to get my kid a watch because they're walking to school. And I'm like, oh, how far away is school? And they're like 3 blocks. And I'm like, maybe your kid could walk to school without a location tracker on their watch.
But that's interesting, right? I mean, we literally growing up, we were told, head on out, see you at lunch, head on out, see you at dinner, and that we had no way of getting in touch with anybody. And it felt perfectly safe and normal and made sense to me. Of course, I was the child in this situation. And yeah, I have to admit, again, keep saying, validating what older children's parents' experiences. But yeah, that sense of autonomy and the ability. I was reading a book, How to Raise an Adult, and talked about like in Japan, people send their 6-year-olds on the subway to get to school. And I'm like, yes, I would love to be there. How do I divorce myself from this, like you said, decrease for tolerance for ambiguity to get to a space where I can we live in Kansas, so there are no subways that I'm aware of, but theoretically speaking, right?
Absolutely. I think it's so important that we recognize that we want to build a world that's safe enough that our kids can be out in it, and that they also know what to do if they get hurt or if they have a problem, and that we just live in a world where people would help. I mean, I've seen kids get hurt on the playground. I've helped out kids or figured out, what to do, or I would let someone use my phone if there was a kid without a phone and they needed to call somebody. So I think we have to allow for the fact that, you don't necessarily want to get all the sort of challenges that come with getting that 8-year-old a phone. Maybe you just want to kind of teach the kid how to make decisions about who they would ask for help if they're in a situation where they're out without a grown-up and they need something.
Oh, and I love that too, right? Recognizing like who could you go to, who looks like a person that would make sense. I think people have said in the past, like go to a person who has children to ask them.
Right. I think that can be a safe choice, and just, or like someone who works there, like at the library or et cetera. And a lot of kids are very nervous to go up to even a librarian in the children's room, which is like about the safest, nicest person like if you're going to talk to a stranger, like that's going to be a very friendly person most of the time. And so, that's a good practice person. It's like, oh, you can't find the book. Why don't you ask the librarian behind the desk? I bet she can help you, and just get some practice getting help, because we don't want our kids to be so phone dependent that if they get lost, they can't just ask somebody for directions.
That's a good point as well. Yes. I know it's interesting because I remember I grew up in the time of like, when I was driving, we would go to MapQuest and we would print something out on a piece of paper, and you would be driving and you would like wait to the next stop and be like, okay, now where do I turn here? And then I go this way. And where now everything really is at the access of our fingertips, which can again work for us because that is very helpful to be able to just plug it into Apple CarPlay or whatever system you may have and be able to go from there. And also being able to say, I don't know what to do, and I'm going to ask another human for some assistance. Yeah. Wonderful. Oh gosh, this is so great. Again, it's nice for me to be able to kind of see that there are ways to go about things, like besides the ways that my anticipatory anxiety has led to me to deal with discussing with my therapist for the stresses of technology, right? So I wanted to discuss the difference, because you've mentioned the difference between a fear-based approach and a shift to an empathy-based approach regarding technology.
Yeah, an empathy-based approach is so important. We want to really think about teaching our kids that there's someone else on the other end of all these screen-based interactions, whether it's Roblox, group text, social media, and we want to have empathy for their experience, that they're growing up in this world where they are being more scrutinized and their mistakes are more likely to be screenshot and shared, and that can be quite stressful. And so like the dumbest things we ever said or thought probably aren't so public as what our kids have said. And so we need to give our kids some grace around that and help them move forward, or help them move forward if a friend makes a mistake as well, especially if they're, sorry and they're apologizing and they're working to do better. I just think it's really important that we don't kind of hold on to like the dumbest things kids do. Because it's so easy to literally keep receipts, right? It's easy to keep the screenshot. It's easy to kind of go back to it. And instead, we want to have an empathy-based approach, because a fear-based approach is also a real emphasis on getting caught. Like when we say you'll never get into college if you post that, we're really emphasizing that you'll get found out, you'll be caught. And that's really telling kids don't get caught, which in some ways is like, well, then go beyond the VPN or go to the dark web or go to the, secret account that nobody knows and post the horrible thing. And it's like, no, we actually want to tell kids, be the best person you can be. If in doubt, don't share it out. And if you think it could cause harm, definitely don't post it, share it, or like it. And those messages are incredibly important, that we don't want our kids to cause harm. And it's more important to talk about not causing harm and being a good person and being aligned with how you want to be seen, than just not getting caught so you don't get in trouble. And, therefore, you can still get into Princeton now or whatever. That's a very external consequence. And if we lead with that kind of fear-based conversation, we're driving our kids underground, but we're not teaching them how to be good human beings.
Oh, and I like that expression too, driving our kids underground. We're telling them, I'm sorry, I love this so much. I just want to like almost repeat it. Saying it's not about what the end result would be, like getting into Princeton, but about you're making your good choices by being a good person. You're being gracious, giving grace to your friends. We're all allowed to make mistakes. We're allowed to ask questions. We're allowed to be ignorant in a way that we can continue to ask questions and grow and learn and be aware of things. And I really love that versus just saying like, well, if you're going to do it, because that's what people might infer then. Like if you're going to post it somewhere where it can't be seen. Yeah, I really like that a lot. And being the best person that you can be and having the emphasis on that. So that's really, again, kind of all of it about like being intentional about the ways that we're interacting with social media and digital experiences. I really appreciate that. So I wanted to talk about, because I will raise my hand to also be this person. My family lived not anywhere near close to here, and my personal profiles are locked down, and on my professional pages I don't post my kids' names or their faces. But I was curious, like what is your encouragement for excited parents who are like, they just want to share the milestones and the fun moments and the silly comments, the things that, my son says scun screen right now, and I will just be devastated when he stops saying scun screen, that sort of, which I'm now sharing on social media. Right. So like, what is your encouragement for people who want to share these moments on their social media pages, but their children aren't old enough to provide that consent? What does that look like?
I think just if in doubt, then don't share. Like if you think there's any way it could be embarrassing later, and you can always take things down later, or you can also share with a smaller group. I've texted a lot of things just to the grandparents, which is like a very reliable audience who always wants pictures of my son, and there will never be too many, even now that he's a teenager. But many people who follow me, like there could be too many. And for him, too many would be one, because he doesn't want me to do it.
Yeah.
But with little kids, I would think about having a smaller family group, maybe a group text or, a more lockdown space to kind of do like a lot of sharing, and then think about on social media sharing fewer images, and maybe every once in a while go back and change them to private or whatever. Because once you've had the initial joy of sharing, like, do you need to keep that digital record up there forever? Do you want your kid to be able to see that someday? How will they feel? And as they get into elementary school, even I would start really asking for permission, making sure they know who's following you. And if you have a kid who's really chasing the likes, because the flip side of the kid who's like, mommy, don't share me, is the kid who's like, mommy, post my gymnastics routine. I want to see how many people like it. Then you have a kid who's going to be pretty sensitive to like follower count and likes and that kind of feedback in the future, which is very human. Like there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I notice when people follow me and like my content too, it's, the apps are designed to get us where we're more human. And that stuff is going to speak to many of us. But if you know you have a kid who's really sensitive to that, you may not want to kind of push that in their direction and be like, oh yes, let's do it and post it and see how many likes we got. Like, you may want to post that kid less and kind of de-emphasize that, because you don't want them getting hooked on likes and followers before they're even on social media themselves.
That's so interesting to think about too. Yeah, the difference between that, because I have had some friends who've had older kids, and that'll be a comment like, "Oh, look at this video I posted; it got X number of likes," and how indicative that can be of if that might be a problem for them in the future, and the sensitivity that they display in that could certainly be something to keep an eye on. Yeah, yeah. So you're thinking, definitely as they start to get a little older, kindergarten, asking them, I like how you said too, like letting them know who's following you and describing what the lockdown of your account looks like, all of that.
Absolutely. And just being clear too, that if they ever don't want you to post something, or if they see something they want you to take down, that's okay. And that when they get to the age where they're posting their friends, that you want them to ask permission, and that it's okay to say no. So just like we're introducing a consent language around hugs and physical contact in the family, we don't like make our kids hug the grandparents anymore if they don't want to. I think
Yes.
this same kind of language around consent, around sharing, is great to introduce. And then you just have that language of consent to come back to. And that language is so important around for so many reasons. And it's going to be kind of a touchstone to talk about many things throughout their life. So I think it just is really empowering, and it really frees kids, and it can help kids stay close to their parents, to know that they won't be photographed without their permission. It can really undermine trust to share your kid and have them feel vulnerable and exposed without having asked them.
That's a really good point too, because yeah, of course, when it's a baby, I'm the first and last person to admit that was me. Snap, 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 snap. Oh, he rolled over this way. Oh, he rolled over that way. Let me get 17 photos of it. And so making sure that the children are aware and saying like, oh, I'm going to take a picture, and then if they feel that space where they can say no because you've made that aware that they need to, and they have that space and the consent. I like that you're mentioning this too. That's a big conversation having, like, you don't have to give somebody a hug just because they're related to you or because they want one. Like, you, no, thank you. I'm not, my son says, I'm not interested in being touched right now. I don't, it's so cute. I think it's wonderful. So, and it's like, great. And I don't want to be photographed. Yeah. Which, crushes me a little bit sometimes inside, but I don't let him know that, because he doesn't need to know that. If he wants to say no, then that's his choice.
And honestly, you may remember those like peak moments where you haven't been photographed even more than you think, because there's some data showing that when we don't photograph things, we inscribe them differently into memory. So maybe those moments that we really want to photograph, we'll remember differently if we don't. So it's all there for you.
That's a really good point as well. I've tried to be very, like, so my son does gymnastics, for example, and he likes to jump off the end of the tumble track into the cheese pit and do a front flip, but he wants me to record it because he wants to be able to watch himself doing it. And for me, and then I'm like, but then I don't get to watch. And so I'm trying to like get my phone up and get it pointed in the right directions. And then I hit record, and then I'm trying to look. So, but I see what you're saying, right? Because the way that we interpret that versus watching it through the screen of a phone are two very different situations.
100%.
Yeah. And then what about in terms of safety? Do you have any notes on that as well, in terms of sharing your children's information?
I mean, I think
pictures?
we want to be careful. I mean, our kids are much more likely to experience just feeling embarrassed that we post them in their PJs, or, in like with their messy hair and they don't like how they look, or, things that would even surprise you. Whereas like they are less likely to be, thank God, abducted or something like that. That's a much more unlikely outcome. But of course, we don't want to post them in front of our house with the house number. We don't want to ideally, post them in, less clothing. I mean, I think unfortunately, someone who, has a pedophile interest in children, like what they wear may not even be the issue, but the conventional wisdom is like, we don't post our kids maybe in no clothes, or, certainly in no clothes rather, but maybe not in bathing suits, maybe not in leotards. But honestly, I think that's also about your comfort as a family and decisions you might make when they're teenagers and more self-conscious about their body, or tweens going through puberty. I would also just think about having fewer images, not for the external safety as much as their own mental health and safety, that they don't have a ton of images to ruminate about in terms of body image. So that's something to think about. And then they need to know that if anyone ever contacts them or threatens them, even if it's like they broke a rule and they're using an app they're not supposed to, that their safety is your most important concern. And no matter what they did, even if they like, joined Roblox and they weren't supposed to, or they went on an app they weren't supposed to, or whatever they were doing, or they talked to someone they kind of knew it was a bad idea and they continued doing it. If at any point they're being threatened or harassed, or they're scared, or even just doubtful about who someone says they are, and there's all kinds of catfishing stories that are really heartbreaking, where kids, realize they're talking to someone that had bad intentions, and they, at the most extreme, like we end up losing kids to suicide or other things because they feel there's no one they can admit to, and they feel so incredibly ashamed. And I think it's so important to say that no matter what, even if you have done something that you later regret, like I'm still on your side. I'm still here for you. No one should be able to threaten you with exposure to me. There's nothing that I would see that would make me not care about you and want to defend you and be there for you. So you have to make sure that your kid knows that. And then obviously notice any big changes in their behavior around screens and tech. If they seem really stressed out, if they're withdrawing more, if they're wanting to be on it all the time and they're very secretive. I mean, it could be that you just have like a 15-year-old in love. It doesn't, like, not every kid who's being secretive is being extorted, but I do think it's important to think of that as one of many possibilities. Probably one of the less likely ones, but it is important to talk to your kids about those possibilities. And again, keep reiterating that they can always talk to you, and also let them know about other safe adults. If there's something they don't want to talk to you about, they can talk to their pediatrician, or you can like name some people in the community. Maybe you have a sibling that they're close to. It's important for kids to ideally have some choices sometimes about the adults that they come to with different challenges in their lives.
Yes, that's a really great idea to pediatrician, but certainly other adults that they trust and respect and know, because at the end of the day, and that's what I love. This whole conversation goes back to the relationship and letting them know, certainly, again, like, so you've gone behind my back and you've gotten on Roblox, and also there's nothing that you can do that's going to make me not mostly care about your safety. It's not a punitive conversation. I want to keep you protected emotionally, obviously physically. And so that's something that I've definitely been talking about recently a lot, just in my friend group, about wanting our kids to say like, oh my gosh, I don't want my mom to find out, versus, oh my gosh, I got to tell my mom. Like I need my mom's guidance and wisdom, maybe not those words, but that not so much that they're concerned about getting in trouble, but come to me and help me, let me help you. Or perhaps, of course, finding another person who's in our circle in some way, in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
That's really very, very important there. And so from your book as well, from the book description that we're talking about, like, how do we help our children figure out who they are as individuals, knowing that everybody's watching them? This is not something that I had to grow up with. This is not something I had to contend with. So what does that look like?
I think it's really challenging. And this is where we just need empathy for our kids. And we need to not be ever part of kind of piling on, or, amplifying when other kids mess up, because we don't want our kids to ever be, sort of the focus of that kind of pile on. It's really important that we let our kids know that they don't have to share everything about themselves, but also that we respect that kids are sharing differently, and that the boundaries have really changed in our culture. Mm-hmm. And what I see is kids really destigmatizing things that we were taught never to share. Like when I was a teenager, I saw a therapist, and no one even had to explicitly tell me, don't tell anyone. I just kind of figured it out from the culture. I got the memo. Right. And so I didn't tell anyone. And like I'd just like be like, oh, I gotta go, or I have to go to work or whatever.
Certainly.
And I think now kids could say in their social group, like, oh, I've got to go to therapy. Or even, oh, my therapist gave me a really good technique for anxiety. Do you want me to teach it to you? Now that said, I totally respect and would validate kids who see a therapist and prefer to keep it private. That's also totally legitimate and okay. I'm not saying anyone has to or should feel obligated to share anything about their mental health, their physical health, anything that's private and personal. But I like living in a world where it's an option, where you could say, oh, gotta go, gotta bounce, got therapy. And that is a better world, I think. Yes. And so even though there are many ways I think this world is more difficult than the one where you and I maybe were teenagers, I do think in some ways the destigmatization of talking about neurodiversity, of talking about gender and sexuality, of talking about experiences of experiencing racism or gender-based discrimination, like those things, it's positive that kids can talk about that. And I think when adults get nervous, like, OMG, my kid just came out, as gay or bisexual or pansexual, like on social media. Oh no. I would say, well, they're coming out, but they're also coming into a community. they probably thought a little bit about who they were telling and what kind of reaction they would get. They probably didn't do it like thoughtlessly.
Yeah.
And they are changing the world by being so open about themselves. And as much as, again, it makes us nervous because it's not how we were taught to be, it is changing the world and it's changing the culture. And it's hard to watch our kids be on the front line of that because it's not a zero risk scenario.
Right.
But I don't think we have to interpret it, negatively either.
That is so wonderful that you say that. I've always said that to students or patients or clients, whatever setting I was in, that it's nobody's business what your treatment is. And it's also, there is zero shame in it. And so wherever you fall on that spectrum of telling people in a meaningful way versus guarding your peace and keeping your privacy, that's certainly individually up to you. And I really appreciate, you're absolutely right. I feel it's so interesting and it's lovely to see these days kids all over the place, just like my therapist. I go to and it's like, yes, wonderful, but absolutely, you're right. When we were growing up, it was like when I went to a psychiatrist for the first time and got put on Ritalin, my parents told me it was a vitamin because there was so much shame around children. I was in the 4th grade, and of course I figured it out because Ritalin, makes you feel certain ways. But and I, that's the best that they knew, and that's not something that people did, especially, again, I don't like to operate in the gender binary and biological sex, but in the 90s girls did not have ADHD, and so this was a whole new thing to experience. And so it really has been lovely to see, for as many drawbacks as there can be about digital bullying and all of the different things on that side, we really are seeing a real increase, improvement, and discussing all of these things.
Yeah.
And then again, changing the world by being so open, and it's a tough thing to put on them, but making sure that
and again, it's not their obligation. I want to be clear.
yes.
Like, it's really not their obligation, but I'm excited to see it happening. And I think when adults are nervous, we should really look at kids and really respect the ways that they're changing the culture. And they're pretty savvy about it.
It's impressive. They're, for as much as they don't have to be in charge of certain things, they're naturally doing it by recognizing the things that they don't want to participate anymore, or recognizing the things that don't make sense to them. Why would we do it that way when we could do it this way? And so, again, not saying it's theirs, but they're just naturally kind of showing us some better ways of approaching things.
100%.
Yeah. So understanding every person's journey, of course, is very unique, but I was wondering what some common themes were that you've noticed in your work and in your research.
That's an interesting. So common themes. So one of the things I've noticed is that every time there's a new app or a new thing, people panic, right? So like TikTok was like, oh no, and Discord, or, and I think we have to just look at these apps, not to say that there's like nothing to be concerned about, because I do think if your kid is spending a lot of time on an app, you kind of want to know, like, what can it do and what kinds of experiences and what kind of community is my child joining? So but ideally we're having an attitude of curiosity and not just panic. And that's true if you're not sure if you're going to let your kid on an app too. Like, maybe your kid's not ready for TikTok, or they're too young, but you kind of might want to like check it out yourself so you can decide before they even ask. And those are some things we want to think about. So that's one of the big commonalities I see. And then I also just see that, I go to schools all over the country and all over the world, and I would say people have more in common than not on these issues. I mean, certainly there's like different problems in different communities to some degree, but I do think overall, all parents everywhere are very concerned about this stuff, and they do want more privacy for their kids. They do want the ability for kids to take posts down after they've been shared. They do worry about kids getting kind of canceled or in trouble. So I think that's a pretty universal set of concerns at this point.
It is tough. I love, you mentioned it earlier, and I'll reiterate, like, when we would say something out of character, out of turn, rumors do exist, but then they're forgotten about and moved on. Screenshots can last forever, even if you do take the post down. And so that is definitely a different consideration for this generation versus in the past. And I like you said too, like, people have more in common than not, and being able to I like, again, we're just coming back to the being gracious and giving people space. And I also encourage people generally, like, if something doesn't sit well with you or make sense, to just keep scrolling.
Absolutely. And teaching kids that they can look away, that they can try to change by liking things they actually like. They can change their own algorithm and maybe change their feed a little bit. We do want to empower kids, and we want to talk to them about the yucky stuff that's out there and that stuff we don't want them to look at as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned being curious and not panic, approaching things with curiosity and not panic. And literally, I end this show every time with "Be curious, not judgmental." And I like that too, being curious and not panicking. Like before we jump into an emotional response to something, getting to know what it is and taking that time, and then making an informed decision with a response versus a reaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got the book is coming out soon. What's the official launch day?
September 12th.
Yes. September 12th. And can people pre-order now or
Yes, they can absolutely get the book, today. I mean, they can
okay.
order it today and it will
Order
be
today.
on their doorstep by the time they're sort of past Labor Day weekend barbecue.
Wonderful, wonderful. So and now where can everybody find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Devorah Heitner, Ph.D., and also on Substack, devorahheitner.substack.com, and my own website, devorahheitner.com. And then my book is in all the places you can get books.
Yes, amazing. I thank you so much for the conversation. It's so important. It's so meaningful. It is on so many people's minds with, my friend group, we all have younger children, certainly people who I know who have older children, and it's an ongoing thing and it's ever changing. And so it's nice to kind of get our feet where we can get our feet under us and then also be willing to be flexible as things change.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I'm really excited to be in the conversation. And I hope people just stay really curious. Talk to your friends. If you have friends or siblings with kids who are a little older than yours, or if they're trying something that you haven't tried, these are great conversations. I think we don't talk enough about screen time. It's kind of taboo in parenting because we all want to pretend our kids are just at home playing with wooden blocks all the time. And
Oh gosh,
that
yes.
our older kids are just too busy with like their, I don't know, award-winning science projects or whatever. But
Their
it's
algebra.
good to be realistic about the fact that most of us are using this stuff a fair amount and it's a big part of our lives.
Mhm.
And therefore talking with other parents is really helpful.
Well, I love that, and this could be a whole other tangent, but I would be curious, and we'll never know, but I would be curious what Maria Montessori would say about technology, because everyone's like, well, it's not Montessori approved because there's no technology, and it's like, well, because technology wasn't around back then, and so I encourage everybody to not sit on a place of superiority. If you don't want to use technology, fine, and also understanding that it does have its place for education, and also can I just send out, if anybody out there needs to cook something and your children are screaming at you and you go put on an episode of Bluey, more power to you. No one's gonna die. Go make your dinner, let your children, like the
That's basically
judgment.
what kids TV was invented for. So yeah,
Hello.
I agree. And I think the more judiciously we use it there, the more power it has, honestly.
Mm, I like that. That's a good point. Yes, absolutely.
If your kids always have access to it, then it may be less exciting for them when you really need it to be.
Yeah, being judicious about that is, yeah, because it's like, oh well, whatever. But yeah, it's like a Bluey episode, you say. Yes, I will go sit quietly and watch that so you can finish making dinner or whatever the situation might be.
Yeah.
But again, it's operating in so again, let's be curious, not judgmental, right? Is making sure that if you have
Mm-hmm.
something that you want to learn from somebody else, certainly ask questions. And if you just disagree with how they're doing it and no one is in any sort of imminent danger, then click on past.
That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much again. Congratulations on your book coming out.
Thank
We'll
you.
put all of this information in the show notes as well, so you all can just easily scroll down and click and go order the book. So I will end also with be curious, not judgmental, but also operating in curiosity and not panic. Thanks so much again, everyone. Have a good one.